Inside modern strike authorization systems, the failure does not begin when approval disappears. It begins when approval is still present, but no longer early enough to govern the kill chain below it. The sequence is already tightening. Targeting has matured. Readiness has advanced. Timing has started closing around a possible release window. And authority is now being asked to arrive inside a path that has already begun preparing to continue. That is the break. Because strike authorization is supposed to do more than confirm that a formal process still exists. It is supposed to govern whether commitment should form at all. But compressed kill chains do not wait in a neutral state while approval catches up. They begin organizing. Sensors stabilize, tracks hold. Weapons posture changes. Supporting nodes align around the expectation that a strike path may soon be cleared. Nothing has been released yet. No formal boundary has been crossed. But the structure is no longer standing still. It is leaning. And once the kill chain begins leaning toward release before approval has fully governed the sequence, authority is no longer controlling the point that matters most. It is entering after commitment has already started to form. That is why this failure is harder to see. Everything still looks disciplined. The process is still intact. Approval still exists in the architecture. The authorization layer still appears to be functioning, but the order of control has already shifted. The kill chain is not waiting to be governed. It is preparing to be confirmed. That difference matters because a strike chain is not just a line of formal decisions. It is a timed structure. Once timing begins to narrow, every layer below authority starts reading the sequence differently. Readiness stops feeling provisional. Alignment stops feeling temporary. Preparation begins to acquire direction. The structure is no longer asking whether a strike path might emerge. It is beginning to organize around the possibility that one already has. And that is where the approval gap opens, not when authority is removed. When authority is still formally present, but the kill chain beneath it has already begun hardening faster than approval can still govern it. That shift grows fast because readiness is never isolated. The moment a strike path begins looking plausible, more of the system starts arranging itself around the possibility that it will proceed. Weapons assignment becomes more concrete. Timing windows become more important. Positioning, coordination, and release conditions begin narrowing around a sequence that is supposed to remain contingent. The kill chain becomes sharper before authority has finished deciding whether it should still be allowed to sharpen. And that matters because preparation is not passive. Every step taken in advance makes reversal weaker later. Not because the system has disobeyed, because the system has already begun building directional weight. The more tightly the sequence is prepared, the harder it becomes for approval to function like true control. It starts functioning like delayed permission inside a structure that is already converging. That is the approval gap. Formal authority remains visible, but below it, the kill chain has already begun turning possibility into expectation. And expectation changes how the rest of the architecture behaves. Supporting elements stop treating the strike path as one option among many. They start treating it as the path most likely to survive. That alters timing, it alters posture, it alters what downstream elements are now preparing to protect. Because once enough layers begin organizing around an anticipated strike, pending approval no longer sits above a neutral sequence. It sits above a sequence already under pressure to continue. That pressure may still look procedural. It may still look orderly, but the result is the same. Approval is being compressed into the tail end of a process that has already started producing commitment. And commitment does not need release to become dangerous. It only needs enough preparation to make interruption feel increasingly costly. That is how the kill chain begins to harden. A timing lane is preserved. A release logic remains available. Support relationships stay in place. The structure holds readiness close to execution because pulling away too early now threatens speed, continuity, and control of the window. That looks efficient. It looks disciplined. But it also means more of the architecture is now protecting a path that approval has not yet fully governed. So the structure keeps moving, not through open violation. Through accumulation, the target remains live. The strike package remains aligned. The release corridor stays available. Timing logic continues narrowing. Support relationships remain in place. The kill chain preserves readiness because disengaging too early now carries operational cost. Now authority enters a sequence that already has momentum. And momentum changes the meaning of every approval decision that follows. Because the question is no longer simply whether the strike should be permitted. The question has become whether authority is willing to interrupt a path that has already consumed time, alignment, preparation, and downstream expectation. That is a different decision, and it is a weaker one. The approval layer is still formally empowered. It can still say yes, it can still say no. But it is no longer making that decision from ahead of commitment. It is making it from inside commitment, from behind readiness, from behind sequence compression, from behind a structure that has already started arranging itself around execution. That is how control begins to thin without disappearing. Nothing looks lawless. No one has removed authorization. No one has declared that the approval layer no longer matters. But the kill chain is already behaving like delay is more disruptive than continuation. And once that happens, every downstream preparation step begins increasing the cost of restraint. A readiness posture that was supposed to remain temporary starts feeling necessary to preserve. A timing window that was supposed to remain conditional starts feeling expensive to lose. A strike path that was supposed to remain interruptible starts feeling like the path the structure has already invested in. That is how the decision space contracts. Not by deleting options, by making one option progressively harder to abandon. Authority is still present. The problem is sequence position. It has arrived too late to shape the path cleanly, so it now confronts a kill chain that is harder to stop than it should have been allowed to become. And that changes the internal weight of approval itself. Because once the sequence has already aligned, saying yes feels like continuation. Saying no feels like disruption. Saying yes preserves the work already done below. Saying no forces the structure to absorb the cost of reversal. That does not eliminate control, but it does distort it. The approval layer is no longer governing an uncommitted chain. It is arbitrating inside a kill chain that has already begun committing around the strike path. Once approval loses sequence position, correction starts trailing commitment. That is the real consequence. Because authority can still intervene in theory, but by then it is intervening against a kill chain that is already tightened around release. The system still shows discipline. The forms still hold. The authorization layer still appears intact, but the governing force has shifted downward into preparation, timing, and accumulated readiness. That means the final approval no longer carries the full weight it appears to carry. It lands after the strike path has already been strengthened by the rest of the chain. So even when restraint remains possible, it is weaker than it should be. It arrives later. It costs more. It acts against more built-up alignment. And once that pattern becomes normal, the architecture begins teaching itself a dangerous lesson. That commitment can form first. That authority can validate from behind. That formal approval is still enough, even when it no longer governs early enough to control the sequence. Now the structure has preserved the appearance of command while weakening the point of command itself. That is the authority break. Not that approval vanished. That approval remained in the loop while losing control over when the loop still mattered. And when a strike architecture accepts that pattern, the final decision stops functioning as a true governing boundary. It becomes the last procedural step inside a kill chain already moving toward its outcome. That is the loss of control, not a visible collapse of hierarchy, a displacement of hierarchy. The approval layer still sits at the top of the process on paper, but the outcome is already being shaped below it by readiness, alignment, and the cost of interruption. So the structure begins producing a false image of safety. It still contains approval. It still preserves formal sequence. It still shows a final decision point. But the real governing work has already been diluted because the strike path has been allowed to gather strength before the decision fully arrives. At that point, authority is no longer setting the chain. It is chasing it. This is why strike authorization cannot be judged by whether approval still exists on paper. It has to be judged by where approval still sits in the sequence. Because a strike authorization system does not preserve control by keeping formal authority visible at the top. It preserves control by ensuring that commitment cannot form beneath that authority before the decision has fully governed the path. That is the doctrine. If readiness tightens first, if alignment deepens first, if downstream preparation begins hardening first, then the approval layer is already late. And once approval becomes late, authority starts reacting to the kill chain instead of governing it. That is not a minor delay. It is a structural change in where control actually lives. A system like that may still look compliant. It may still show procedural order. It may still preserve every formal sign of disciplined authorization. But if commitment forms ahead of approval, then the strike path has already advanced beyond the point where authority was supposed to hold it. And when that happens, the approval process is no longer governing force. It is trailing force. That distinction is the whole standard. The question is not whether an authorizing layer still touches the sequence before release. The question is whether that layer still governs before readiness, timing, and preparatory alignment have already turned the strike path into the system's preferred outcome. If the answer is no, then the architecture has already shifted. It may still preserve legality. It may still preserve order. It may still preserve formal discipline. But it no longer preserves control at the point where control is supposed to matter most. Because true authorization is not a ceremonial confirmation placed at the end of a prepared chain. It is a governing boundary that holds before the kill chain is allowed to harden around execution. Once that boundary moves too far downstream, the rest of the structure begins doing what authority was supposed to prevent. It starts manufacturing commitment in advance. And any strike system that allows commitment to form ahead of approval is no longer using authorization to govern force. It is using authorization to ratify momentum. A strike authorization system begins to fail the moment approval is still required, but no longer early enough to stop the kill chain from committing first.